Vladimirovich, thank you very much for agreeing to come. I am eagerly looking forward to our interview.
Thank you for the invitation, it's very kind.
I have a lot of questions. I've already spoken with Anatoly Fomenko, but I still have many unanswered questions. I wanted to ask them to you. I'll start with the most important one. How did you come to join this research? How did it happen?
It was in 1981. I had just graduated from the Department of Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics of Moscow Institute of Electronics and Mathematics with a degree in mathematical engineering and started working at the Space Research Institute. Besides me, there were other mathematicians at this institute. We had a small math seminar. At this seminar, one of the young math graduates from the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics, Kolya Chebotaryov, mentioned that Fomenko, whom I knew well as a lecturer because I attended his special courses at the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics, was proving that ancient Greece did not exist and neither did ancient Rome. He shared these interesting things. It was the first time I heard about it. Honestly, I had doubts about history since school. In the 5th or 6th grade, I was a straight A student and participated in various Olympiads. They sent me to all sorts of competitions, not only in mathematics but also in painting, for example. Once I participated in a history Olympiad. I remembered it for the rest of my life. There was only one question. I can't say for sure now, but it went something like this. Ancient Greeks lived on some island and greatly revered the goddess Demeter. That was the problem description. And that's it. The required solution was to describe the life of these ancient Greeks. I have a mathematical mindset, and the task amazed me. The problem is given, and from this problem, through general logical reasoning, you need to derive a solution. The problem stated that some ancient Greeks revered the goddess Demeter, and as a solution, you are required to describe the life of these ancient Greeks. I didn't understand how to derive a solution from the given problem. I was intensely curious. I didn't write anything, not a single word, and simply handed in a blank sheet of paper. I stayed to wait for the analysis because there was always a discussion after the Olympiad, and the instructor explained the correct solution. The correct solution involved writing an essay. I don't remember exactly. Maybe around 10 pages. It described how these ancient Greeks went fishing, how they hunted, how they did this, did that. Their entire life was detailed. It amazed me. So, I understood, firstly, that I would never engage in this, that it was completely alien to me, some kind of fiction. After all, I was a schoolboy. I couldn't articulate it like that. Still, it was science. But at least I realized that this field of activity was entirely alien to me, and history was something incomprehensible, some unknown field of work. That's it. I forgot about it, or rather, I remembered it, but it remained in my subconscious. At our internal seminar, we entertained ourselves by discussing mathematics and giving presentations to each other. I remember that Kolya Chebotaryov thought we were bored, and when he told us about it, I became very interested. So, the unresolved question that lingered in my mind about what kind of science was so fascinating and engaged in such things, suddenly found some, if not a solution, at least a possible outlet. I found it very intriguing. I came home and took a book from the shelf. To save time, among the books on my shelf, I found one where world history was described most briefly. It was Machiavelli's History of Florence. In the early chapters, he outlined world history. Then he transitioned to the history of Florence. Like many medieval historians, he began almost with the creation of the world and reached the subject he needed. In the first chapters, probably in 30 to 40 pages, I can't recall exactly, the history of the Roman Empire was presented. I started reading. I read and read. Everything was good, understandable. That's probably how it really was. It was interestingly described. But on some page, I suddenly caught myself thinking that I had already read this somewhere on the previous pages. I won't take time to describe what exactly it was, although I do remember, but I don't want to take up time now. Certain events were described, and I remember having read about them before. I flipped back a few pages and saw that indeed, it was the same. But in one case, it was presented with great emphasis, and many words were spoken on the subject. In another case, it was mentioned briefly, but it was absolutely the same. And it related to different times, different Roman emperors. I then checked which emperors were involved. By that time, Kolya Chebotaryov or someone else from the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics had given me a 100-page abstract by Fomenko on this topic. I delved into the abstract and looked up the tables of events regarding this emperor and that emperor, which seemed completely identical to me. Were these emperors truly corresponding to each other in Fomenko's tables? I saw that, indeed, the first and the second emperors in Fomenko's tables corresponded to each other. This convinced me that there was something to it. Back then, I couldn't say that it was really true, that I believed in it. But mathematicians don't have the concept of believing. I understood that it wasn't just empty talk. There was something to it. I read that abstract and, as a probabilist, started thinking about how to develop some other method. I had some ideas. Then, one of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics members mentioned that Fomenko was working on processing historical data and invited students to help him. And we decided to join. They were graduates, but it didn't matter. They were still associated with the faculty. Fomenko invited them, and they went to help. I said, "Take me." He said, "Sure, let's go together." And we went. We were involved in the numerical processing of dynasties. At that time, there were no computers. Fomenko devised some very clever geometric methods, how to perform these calculations geometrically. It was all well thought out. There were no computers, but the calculations still had to be done. He performed some analog calculations using geometric techniques. Of course, later, everything was recalculated, but at that time, it was like that. I came, and we worked on it. In the end, I said, "Anatoly Timofeyevich, I have some ideas. I would like to discuss them with you." When everyone left, Fomenko suggested me to stay and tell him more. I explained, he asked me to write a text, and I wrote it. That's how our collaboration began. It was in 1981, and Fomenko had started this in the 1970s. By that time, he had already created the global chronological map, and his article about it had been published in the Proceedings of the Academy of Sciences. It was still the beginning of the work, although he had already accomplished a lot. Since then, we have been working together.
Tell me, what if a young scientist were to repeat this story now, also meeting someone who has long been involved in a certain topic, not your topic, not related to history, but something else? How could this young scientist distinguish this researcher who has already achieved some results from a fanatic who is passionate about something but is mistaken, taking a wrong track? What would you advise such a young version of yourself in the past, or a young scientist like you?
At the time, I didn't just believe. Firstly, I already had some compelling reasons. I had a question in my mind from my school years. So, that was the first thing that motivated me. Secondly, I somehow checked. I didn't just go to Fomenko and say, let me join. No, I read Machiavelli's history, and I actually found a duplicate there. I really made sure it was a duplicate, which, by the way, Fomenko didn't know about, but it exactly matched his table. So, I did some preliminary work to find out if such an activity made any sense or not. And when I was convinced that yes, it made sense, that there was something there, that's when I joined this work. Naturally, it was for a good reason. In reality, there is a lot of nonsense out there. There's a lot of idle talk, and you can't just believe it. I don't advise anyone to do so. So, if you've heard something and it somehow captivated you, interested you, you need to verify it with the means available to you. I can't provide recipes. There's no general recipe for how to verify all this. But in each case, probably, in its own way, in my case, that's how I did it.
Very often, when reading criticism of the new chronology, you can come across an argument that is summarized as follows. They are not historians. They are mathematicians. What can they understand about history? At that time, didn't you feel that the man was out of his element and could simply be fundamentally wrong because he was not an historian?
You see, what distinguishes mathematicians from everyone else? What are we mathematicians taught? What others are not taught? They are taught the opposite. Mathematicians have no limitations. That is, we are mathematicians, and we are given a certain method. We study the method, and then it's our business to apply this method to whatever we find suitable for it. In other words, there is methodology, and any problem is our problem. We don't have such a notion that there are our problems, our domain, and there are other people's problems, other people's domains. Mathematicians don't have that, and it's part of their education. If we talk about all other disciplines, almost all of them, I don't know about physicists for sure. Among humanitarians, absolutely everything is divided into sections. Even among historians. By the way, a historian of the recent past, a historian of the Middle Ages, and a historian of the ancient world won't trespass into each other's territory. This one deals with this history, that one deals with that history, and the third one deals with his own. Each is allocated his allotment, and please, work on that allotment, but don't meddle in someone else's affairs. This approach is practically universal among them, but not for us. From the very beginning, we didn't even consider this issue. We are brought up, we are trained this way.
How could you formulate a general rule for distinguishing science from pseudoscience, as it is said nowadays?
There is no such general rule. Because science evolves, and it too can accumulate errors or simply not notice them. In science, there is no absolute truth. Make sense? Absolute truth exists only in some belief. If a person believes in something, he understands that it is not science, and he believes. That's his faith. He considers it absolute truth. He has the right, and it's a kind of correct approach. But if he considers himself a researcher, a scientist, then there should be no absolute truth for him, if he is a true scientist. For a real scientist, there is no absolute truth. When he finds and discovers certain things, he also understands that this is not absolute truth. However, this is almost always the case with historians, although not only with historians. In Marxism-Leninism, too, if you lived through that time, they had absolute truth. We will live under communism. That was absolute truth. It couldn't be argued with. Eventually, it turned out not to be true, but if you had tried to say that at the time, it wouldn't have been good for you. So, they work in the concept of absolute truth. Historians also work in such concepts. They have absolute truth. It's the historical concept they were taught in school and in university. It's absolute truth for them. They don't accept anything beyond its boundaries. They defend it. Do you follow me? I would say it's a kind of safeguarding activity. They are guardians. They were handed some understanding, and they guard it. From my point of view, it's not science. I would also like to say the following about science and non-science. Here at home, it is considered that history is a science, and it has been considered so for a long time. This belief is not just from Soviet times. It was also held in the Imperial Russia. So, it's a deeply rooted point of view for us. I also thought so. When I realized that historians were wrong, I was outraged. How is this possible? They are scientists. They should act like scientists, but they act differently. They are wrong. It seemed that way to me. I traveled abroad quite often, teaching mathematics in different countries. In one of my early trips, I was talking to a professor from a Canadian university about history being a science. He said, "What kind of science is that? It's not science." I asked, "How come, not science?" He said, "No, it's not science. It's speculation." For us, speculation is a negative word, but for them, it's perfectly fine. I said, "How can that be? Isn't it science?" "No, it's speculation." Do they agree with that in your country too? Yes, they think the same way. When I understood this, I looked, and indeed, history presents itself as a science. I mean, not that it presents itself, that's incorrect. It's not that it presents itself that way. It is told that it is a science. In our country, historians are told, "You are scholars." But they can't be scholars. They lack scientific methodology and scientific training. They have nothing, no scientific methods. Yet they are told, "You are scholars," and they try to live up to that standard. They feel some need, a necessity to prove that they are scholars. This is what we have over here, but in the West, it's not the same. In China, by the way, the situation is entirely different. I will talk about it now. In the West, there are historians. They are not scholars. They are speculators in a positive sense of the word. That is, people who do not engage in truth-seeking, logical reasoning, but people who engage in plausible reasoning, with the goal of promoting their own country, their own civilization. It's not hidden. Makes sense? This is their bread. They get paid for it, and they are not ashamed of it. So, we don't understand this. We think that there are scholars there too, engaged in some science. No, that's not the case. They know their place. They honestly earn their living. I have no questions for a Western historian. Absolutely no questions for Chinese historians either. When I was in China, the situation was different there. Archaeologists take the lead. In our country, archaeologists are considered secondary. Historians are in charge, and archaeologists dig up artifacts, letting historians deal with the rest. This is our approach, and to some extent, it is similar in the West. In China, it's the opposite. Archaeologists are in charge. They earn several times more, stand apart, look down on historians, don't communicate with them, treating historians as second-rate. Their job is to unearth a vast number of ancient artifacts from the ground, water, or wherever. And they focus on that. I remember during my time in China, in just 3 weeks, I saw on television the discovery of several tons of granite slabs with ancient inscriptions. Right during that time. So, it's all a forgery. In 2010 or 2012, I was invited to Peking University to give a lecture on dating ancient zodiacs. This lecture was mandatory for all history students. The audience was enormous. All students attended, and the Chinese are disciplined. Of course, many students were sleeping. They listened to the lecture. The inviting party was professors from the history faculty of Peking University. In particular, they have a museum with ancient exhibits. We went to this museum, and historians said, "This is a forgery, this is a forgery, this is a forgery." You see, I already knew it was a forgery, but I thought historians should somehow hide it. No, they don't hide it. Chinese historians perfectly understand that it's all a forgery. It's the work of their archaeologists. Archaeologists faked all this, and historians know perfectly well that it's all a forgery. They aren't even asked much about it. There, historians play a minor role. The main thing is to dig it up, exhibit it in the museum, and say, "This is our ancient history." That's how it works there. However, you see, this is not a scientific activity, and none of them considers it scientific activity. But it is useful for the country. It promotes China. Why not? That's how they see it. Once in the 2000s, I worked at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. There, I was also asked to give a lecture on the new chronology. I delivered it to a massive audience consisting of engineering professors. However, in the West, historians and scientists are not brought together. Even if universities have both historical and scientific faculties, they don't interact. They are separate communities and they do not overlap. Usually, there aren't even both faculties. They are separate, typically in different universities. Even if they are in the same university, they don't often interact. I gave a lecture at the Technological University. Of course, there were no historians there. There were professors, mainly Chinese, Indians, many others from various countries. The lecture was listened to with great interest. While delivering it, I thought that maybe the Chinese would object, thinking, how can this be? History is shorter, and they claim it's long. After the lecture, Chinese professors approached me, thanked me, and said that they knew very well that their history is false, invented by historians. They know this perfectly well. It's no mystery to them. So, the situation is exactly like that. Russia is an exception. Worldwide, there are historians and archaeologists who promote their own nations using available methods. They earn money for it and honestly earn their living. They do good things. Then there's Russia, where historians consider themselves scientists. Instead of promoting their own nation and all national, they demote it, based on the argument that it's not scientific. But what is scientific, and what they repeat, is what is said in the West by those who promote their own nations. It's roughly like scoring an own goal during a soccer game. That's how it looks. But people generally don't understand this. The notion of history as a science is an extremely harmful one. Perhaps it was created by Marxism-Leninism. Even Marxism-Leninism was considered a science, if you remember. Scientific, science-based, it was constantly repeated. This made other historians feel even more like scientists. But I say that this has been going on since Tsarist times. That's the situation. When you talk about it, it seems unbelievable. To experience it, you have to travel the world, to work there. Not just look out the bus window, but work in Western universities or Chinese ones, as I did. Then you will see this picture. Otherwise, of course, it seems unusual.
One of the greats once said that in any doctrine of nature there can be only as much proper science as there is mathematics in it. It seems to confirm your words. Perhaps there is not much math in history, and it is more, as you said, a kind of artistic reconstruction of the past. So, I have the next question. Probably, based on what you just said, the new chronology can also be divided into two parts. The first part is where there is mathematics, where you work with dates and zodiacs, there is mathematics. And probably the second part is the reconstruction, where you use an artistic imagination to make your mathematical conclusions more understandable and interesting for the reader. But if I'm not mistaken now, you probably don't consider this part as science either. You consider it more like your play of artistic imagination.
We don't consider it a play of artistic imagination. Of course, it's not science, but it's not a play of artistic imagination because we have no orders. We don't work on commission. We don't get money from anyone to do that. Originally, it was just for ourselves. For a long time, Anatoly Fomenko and I were engaged exclusively in chronological research. We hoped that our historians would try to put some historical flesh on this chronological skeleton. We hoped for it for a long time. We went to historians. We gave them lectures. Mostly, Fomenko gave lectures, and I, along with him, wrote articles and participated in history conferences. There, sometimes, it used to really get you down. I remember, a long time ago at a conference, the question of who came up with the graphs, Fomenko or Rybakov, was seriously discussed. Really, what are graphs? It was seriously discussed. That was the level of debate. But we still hoped. We hoped that an agreement could be reached, that we could work together. At first, there were hopes for this when Ivan Kovalchenko was their academic secretary, who, by the way, was interested in the new chronology. I remember when our book, New Chronology and the Concept of the Ancient History of Russia, England, and Rome was published, the term New Chronology appeared for the first time. I remember seeing Kovalchenko somewhere with our book in hand. He greeted me and said that we would study this, organize a seminar, and, in general, work on it. He was the academic secretary, sort of the chief historian. Then he passed away, and some people came to power in historical science. They are not just some people. They have names, but they approached the matter completely differently, that these are our enemies, and let's go to war with them. That is, it was not us who initiated the war with historians. Their new leadership did, those who came to power, so to speak, after Kovalchenko. They took charge of historical science and adopted a posture of, let's fight. So, we stopped communicating with them because it became impossible. It was just quarreling. We did not intend to quarrel. After that, everything went the way it did. We focus on our work, they criticize us. In general, we don't pay much attention to it. Of course, we read what they write, try to extract something valuable from it, but we couldn't find anything particularly valuable.
You know, I am very surprised by the position of official historians because your new chronology brightens many episodes of our national history, our territories. They are shown from a more attractive angle than in official history. And, seemingly, official historians, many of whom are on the state's payroll, should, in theory, support your line of research. It should seem more patriotic to them, somehow. They should hold on to it, develop this idea, gear their science, as they see it, in this direction. Why don't they do that? What do you think?
This is strange. I didn't fully answer your question about how we perceive our reconstruction. I just started explaining that we were initially together with historians, and then we went our separate ways. We realized that we found ourselves in a situation where we were developing chronology, and historians would not engage in that. We were simply curious ourselves about what the history really was. Not because we wanted to prove something to someone, not because we wanted to build a concept that would portray Russia in a better light. We had absolutely no such goal. Moreover, we were educated in school and were absolutely convinced that Russia was a secondary country on the world stage. We sincerely believed everything historians said, and had no intention of breaking that. But when we realized that they weren't going to engage in the reconstruction and, at least as a hypothesis, align their views with the new chronology, then naturally, to the best of our abilities, we wanted to do it ourselves. When we started doing it, it was very difficult for us to overcome ourselves. When the role of Russia was unexpectedly revealed to us, we were amazed. We didn't dare and couldn't believe it for a long time. But when it became clear, we followed the logic. Reconstruction is not science, but the logic in it is the same as in science. It's not science in the sense that there are no proofs, no numbers, no clear statements. But the logic is the same. Essentially, in building our reconstruction, we construct it roughly as an honest historian would. If you were to put an honest historian in our place, one who doesn't sacrifice logic, and such historians certainly exist, he would derive exactly the same conclusions from our chronology. Because in many cases, there are simply no other options. Sometimes there are options, but then we write that it might be like this or it might be like that. We're not sure. We explicitly state that. Therefore, we often have several versions of how it could have happened. When the picture begins to take shape and has a more or less general framework, it starts to dictate its further development. It's not science, not natural science, but it's science in the sense that it is logical. We don't violate logic anywhere. This is what I want to emphasize. When all of this began to unfold for us, we didn't keep it to ourselves and decided to tell everyone about it because we believe it's important. Especially recently, it turns out that it is directly related to the present time. Although we have boundaries, we don't study history beyond the mid-19th century. We have such a boundary because there is free history and there is political history. It has always been this way. There are those in power today, and there is the past, when their immediate ancestors, their relatives, were in power. And this history is not free. It's natural. We don't deal with that history. We only focus on the history when people who are no longer in power were on the political stage. Everyone from that time is gone, and there are no descendants. Here, we can freely reason. That's why we have such a boundary. We don't delve into history after the mid-19th century. We don't draw any conclusions, write anything, and don't know anything about them. Should anything happen, then what is written in the newspaper, we can repeat it. As for earlier history, we feel free. But despite that, what we have recently discovered in the history of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries has direct implications for the present. We don't draw these conclusions ourselves. I think any reasonable person will draw them on their own. I want to show you a book where this is written. It was recently published and is called Sloven and Rus. This is in case you want to read about what is happening now. Well, it's not explicitly written here, but if you read this book, you will understand what is going on now. This is astonishing. We didn't anticipate that our research, which started purely as chronological and applied mathematics, analyzing complex data, would lead to such conclusions. Of course, we didn't expect that, and it never occurred to us. But we have been working for a long time. Fomenko started in the 1970s, and I joined in 1981. Now it's 2023. That's about 50 years for Fomenko and around 40 for me. But if you engage in a topic for a very long time, interesting things eventually start to unfold. I understand that for people hearing about this for the first time, it's difficult to imagine and comprehend because over these 50 years, we also lived down a lot of prejudice. It's not easy to grasp immediately. Nevertheless, if you want to understand what our past was like and how it has directly resulted in what is happening before our eyes, I recommend reading. By the way, I wanted to show our books. They are written in the most straightforward manner. We decided to publish our reconstruction. These are not scientific books. It's just a reconstruction. We are currently writing it in the form of such installments. It's called Russia and Rome. We have an old edition, Russia and Rome, but that is a different, old book. We started publishing these books relatively recently, in the 2000s. As of today, 5 books have been released, titled, How It All Began, Christ, After Christ, The Great Conquest of the World, and The Cross and Gunpowder. The first 5 volumes have been released, and we've reached the middle of the 14th century. It explains what history looks like from our point of view. Read it if you find it interesting. I understand that at first glance, all of this may seem like fantasy. And there is a certain problem with this because this subject is too complex. There's too much data, too much research, and we've done a lot in 50 years. Yet, we weren't the first. Morozov did a lot before us, which we used, and Newton did a lot. Unfortunately, we didn't use what Newton did because we were not aware of his research. I mean Isaac Newton, the one who invented Newtonian mechanics. In his last years, for several decades, he was involved in history. He wrote a book, titled, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, which we didn't know about for a long time. It was taken out of scientific circulation. Once, during Newton's lifetime, it was published in a French translation, and the second time after his death, it was published in English, directly his text. After that, it was removed from circulation. Morozov didn't know about it. In other words, there was a complete suppression of this book. We didn't know about it for a long time, and then Fomenko accidentally found it. He found a preprint. He purchased a preprint made by historians for internal use in the United States. This preprint dates back to the year 1722, if I remember correctly. We published it in Russian. We didn't publish it ourselves, but under our supervision, this book has been translated into Russian. The Rimmes Publishing House published it in 2 columns, the English text and the Russian translation with our preface. I recommend reading it. Newton approaches history as a naturalist in this book. Again, he doesn't calculate anything there. He approaches it from a logical point of view. He examines historical events and looks at them logically. His conclusion is that there are many duplicates in history. In other words, the same events are narrated on different pages of a hypothetical textbook where everything is written. Events are assigned to different epochs, under different names, narrated in slightly different light, but in reality, it was one event. Certain people participated in it. Then, on paper, it multiplied, and today we think there were several events happening at different times, and the names of the participants are also different. In his book, Newton clearly expresses the idea that history consists of multiplied scraps. There is some event. It is multiplied and stitched into different chronological segments. A very interesting book. He only examines the ancient history of Greece and Egypt, but that is enough. He expressed a completely correct principle. We have a list of other names. I won't repeat them now. Everything is in our book. Jean Hardwin should be mentioned as well. There are many others. A distinct topic could be dedicated to our predecessors. No scientific discovery can be made just out of the blue. We all understand perfectly well that one can't just start from scratch and make a great discovery. This is suitable only for some propagandistic and popular science books. A great scientist sat down at the desk and made the greatest discovery, just by himself, from scratch. This is never the case. A discovery is always the result of a chain of scientific studies. Someone started, then someone continued, then someone else continued. At the end of this scientific path, a great discovery arises. And it's served up to the people, like in epic tales. A hero rides out and defeats everyone alone. People like such a picture, it is favored. This is how many great discoveries are envisioned. In reality, it is never that way. There is always a previous history. In our new chronology, there is also a very significant previous history. We had great predecessors. I mentioned two, but there were more. They were also renowned individuals. Why us, specifically? Why did we make this discovery? Firstly, we were not at the beginning of the journey. Secondly, computational tools came into play. The theory of probability emerged. Our previous predecessor was Morozov. Back then, the theory of probability was not fully developed. Statistics is a 20th century invention. If you look, Fisher's work dates back to the 1930s. Kolmogorov provided the axiom system for probability theory in the second half of the 20th century. Computational tools also appeared right before our eyes. We essentially got what was lacking for our predecessors. And, of course, it worked for us.
For our listeners, using one example from your reconstruction, I want to illustrate the assumptions made by Newton. In one of your books, you hypothesize that Nero and Ivan the Terrible, two seemingly distinct figures from different periods in classical history, might be one and the same person.
Two reflections of the same individual. Historians think that history is, well, not that they really think so. They might genuinely believe it, I don't know, or they pretend to think so. But they say it. There is history where there are events. History consists of events, and what we study today are precisely these events. So, if we learn that Julius Caesar said something, it means, as they envision it, that he really said it. He stood there and spoke. In reality, we don't study events. We study reports about these events, which were written by someone, rewritten many times, again rewritten many times and compiled from various sources, undergoing a long paper life. In other words, we are actually studying texts. Of course, historians will say that we have a lot of original artifacts excavated from the ground. This is a separate topic. Regarding the artifacts dug up from the ground and stored in archives, this is a separate topic. It's not quite as they think. Well, not that they think so. Again, I don't know what they think. This is what they say. But the foundation of history is by no means what is excavated from the ground. By the way, remembering Hardwin, I want to say that he was a very famous person, the director of the French Royal Library, a numismatist, historian, and he was Newton's friend. Jean Hardwin wrote in Latin, and he was a Jesuit. He argued that almost all artifacts, coins, statues, which historians believe are the basis of their version, are practically all forgeries. We don't consider all of it to be forgeries. No, there are plenty of originals. Of course, a lot of originals are dug up from the ground. But these originals must be properly studied. Not to try passing them off as evidence of the existing concept, which historians do. In doing so, they put some things under the table, and they put on the table what they think will prove their version. That's what they do. There was a well-known story with the historian Valentin Yanin, who was an opponent of the Norman theory. When they were excavating, I think, in Novgorod, they dug up a sword hilt that they considered Norman. Again, considered. These are all theories. They believed that this hilt was Norman. And Yanin believed that there were no Normans. So, what did he do? He buried it back. Archaeologists told us about this. That's the approach. I'll put on display what fits my point of view. What doesn't fit, I'll push aside. They even have a practice that if an archaeologist excavated something, found it, then only one person can study that item. It is considered wrong for another person to get involved. So, you study it, keep doing it, others shouldn't interfere. Why? Because there are no criteria, no objectivity. If someone else gets involved, he may draw different conclusions, and then there will be a mess. Therefore, everything must be in accordance with the established order. These are all attempts to create the appearance of science from something that is not science.
Our channel is primarily visited by programmers. In the interview with Fomenko that we published just a week ago, one of the comments was quite rude, but nevertheless, I would like to mention it and use it as a starting point for the following question. The comment was, "You might as well invite flat earthers." In other words, any alternative perspective, any attempt to analyze something in an alternative way, people often make it look like conspiracy theories. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, it means you're on par with flat earthers, deniers of the existence of Australia, and so on. They paint all alternative scientists, not just historians, with the same brush, call them conspiracy theorists, and consequently declare them pariahs, stating that it makes no sense to listen to them. What is your attitude towards other alternative scientists who deny something else? You deny traditional history in a certain sense. There are people who deny many other things. Do you listen to them, read them, respect them? Or do you have some other attitude toward them?
First of all, I want to say that by education, I am an applied mathematician and have been heavily involved in programming. Although I am in the business of scientific programming, programming has changed a lot. Initially, it was scientific, done by mathematicians and physicists. Now, engineers are involved in programming, and it has changed significantly. Currently, I don't personally code, I only oversee the process. But I understand programmers well and constantly work with them, so I understand their point of view. If we consider that everything alternative is false, then in 99% of cases, we would be correct. Therefore, if you develop such an approach, without delving into it, to establish a decision rule, so to speak, or choose a strategy that everything alternative, everything unusual is false, statistically, it is a reasonable strategy. You don't worry about anything else, don't think deeply about anything, and you'll be right in 99% of cases. The metrics will be good. Perhaps, from a statistical point of view, such an approach is reasonable. On the other hand, if we return once again to the history of science, we know that in almost all sciences, an alternative view emerged, which was declared absurd, and then turned out to be correct. Yes, it's a rare event. In 99% of cases, it is in their favor. But there is a percentage they will miss. In 1% of cases, they are wrong. If we talk about that 1%, just 1%, it exists, and we know examples. I watched your interview with Anatoly Fomenko. He gave a very vivid example with Lobachevsky, who was simply harassed for his non-Euclidean geometry. And these were well-known scientists of his time, although he was absolutely right. It's almost the same in any science. In medicine, there has been a lot of this. I don't remember the name, but there was an English medic in the 17th century who tried to advance the correct theory of blood circulation. His house was burned down. He was persecuted, even though he was right. There was such rage. In physics, quantum mechanics, I think someone from the well-known physicists said that quantum mechanics was simply accepted by the subsequent generation of physicists. No one accepted it, but then young people who grew up hearing about it from a young age accepted it. But none of the older generation did. Therefore, in the sciences there can be breaks, and generally, sciences know how to overcome these breaks. It's painful, but they pass through. But in history, there are no breaks. Everything is smooth and good, and calm. Whatever some historian said once, it means it's correct. We provide just one of the vivid examples. They could be cited endlessly. I could give examples for hours. But I will give just one. Dendera zodiac in Egypt. The renowned Egyptologist Champollion wrote a work on dating this zodiac. He dated it to the times of Claudius and Nero, Roman emperors of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. How did he do it? There is the description of Egypt in which scholars who accompanied Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt sketched many things there. In particular, this zodiac is sketched in this album, along with inscriptions around the zodiac. This includes 2 cartouches that Champollion studied and in which he found hieroglyphs that he read as the names of Claudius and Nero. Based on this, He wrote a study stating that it was Claudius, Nero, the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Roman Empire, and the zodiac was created during that time. Over time, it turned out that these cartouches are simply empty. They still exist. You can come and see that these cartouches are empty in the place where Napoleonic artists depicted them. No one knows why they depicted these hieroglyphs there. In modern editions, of course, they are left empty. There are more modern special editions in which they are empty. I have personally seen them. They are absolutely empty, and there was never anything in them because they are authentic. The zodiac itself was broken out and is now in the Louvre, and these hieroglyphs around it are still there in their original form. And you can see that they are not just empty. They have always been empty. They are not filled. Nothing has been crossed out. There are such cartouches that are not filled. And based on non-existent inscriptions, Champollion made his conclusion. He gave the dating. The question is, discovering that the inscriptions are absent, did historians review Champollion's dating? Did they say, let's go back to this issue, let's study it again because the person made a mistake? He himself wasn't in Egypt. I don't know, maybe he was, but at least he used the description of Egypt. Of course, he was there, but his conclusions are based on these publications. In this publication, there is the basis for his conclusion, but it is false. In reality, it does not exist. No revision. And to this day, Champollion's dating is considered universally accepted. You see? It's such a principle. If our historian once said something, even if it turns out he was wrong, it's still considered true. That's how it is. So, this is an approach based, apparently, on some subconscious understanding that they are wrong. And since they are wrong, it's better not to hit this house of cards too hard because it might collapse. This house is fragile. If a person is confident that everything is correct, well made, and logically sound, they might want to shake it. Isn't that so? Shake it and check if there's really something wrong with it, something that needs to be redone or rebuilt. But they are afraid to shake it. They understand that everything there is fragile, nothing is proven, and it's better not to even breathe in its direction. If something has been said, let it be that way. And this is a common approach.
What do you think? How can artificial intelligence help us in all of this? I asked Anatoly Fomenko, and I want to know from you too, as a programmer. How do you think artificial intelligence, which is now emerging and actively developing, can help in further research of history, chronology, and the new chronology?
I currently don't see an application for artificial intelligence. I understand perfectly well what artificial intelligence is. I work with it. But as for history, I don't see an application for artificial intelligence in its current state. There are no tasks in history, in the chronology of the past, that artificial intelligence could solve. What is artificial intelligence? Roughly speaking, it's almost the same as our intelligence. It's a kind of black box that produces some solutions. But it doesn't produce these solutions just like that. On what basis does it produce solutions? Based on the input data and based on something that it has inside this box, its knowledge. Just like a human, it answers questions based on data and based on what it has in its brain. Artificial intelligence is trained. So, it's a black box. What can it be like? We can either put an algorithm into it, just think it through and embed it. It will be a program. We understand how it's coded. We understand its logic. We wrote it ourselves, and then it gives answers according to the algorithm we embedded in it. Artificial intelligence is a different thing. We take a blank. There are layers. You know how artificial intelligence is structured. By the way, there is a theorem that states that a neural network can give any answer to any question. It is a function of the input data. So, in principle, a neural network can implement any decision rule. But to do that, it needs to be trained on some cases. It's somewhat similar to us.
We grow, learn, go through something, memorize things.
We see when our actions are right or wrong, solutions are correct or incorrect. And eventually, we have a neural network. That's why it's called that way. It was also trained and answered some question. And here we see that indeed, if you train it for a long time, it will answer not only the questions it was trained on but also other questions, and it will answer them reasonably. However, in the ancient history, there are not many identical cases. That is, the very formulation of the problem of how to use a neural network seems vague to me. It doesn't mean that it cannot be done, but I cannot currently formulate how it can be applied. Knowing what a neural network is, finding a task for it in this area is something I cannot do at the moment.
I have a feeling that history has been preserved for us not only in archaeological finds that we unearth, but also in the language we use and in the documents at our disposal. And in these texts from the past, theoretically, there remains a certain signature, handwriting, a certain style of that time in which they were written. And it seems to me that the development of language is also well tied to dates, just like the moon and the movement of planets. If we give a neural network a large amount of these texts and train it through these texts, it might tell us in which times certain sentences were written.
Yes, it will tell you starting from the 17th century. Earlier, no. Because we don't have earlier examples. And if they exist, they are not accurate. They are incorrectly dated. You see? If you train it on the historical concept that is widely accepted, it will give you conclusions in line with that concept. Train it on the new chronology, and it will give you conclusions in line with the new chronology. That's how it will work.
So, we need mathematics. Okay. Well, and the last question. Do you think it is often dangerous to question sensitive for humanity issues, such as events of the past? Even if you say that you touch on events of the past that are 200 or 300 years away from us.
If you want to understand whether it's dangerous or not, I repeat my advice, read this book. When you read it, you will understand whether it's dangerous or not. It might be very dangerous for some people but might not for others.
There are scientists or speculators pretending to be scientists who analyze many events of the past and the recent past. And they use this as a tool in political struggles, a tool for manipulating consciousness, and so on. And maybe it makes sense to block or prohibit certain branches of science or history. What do you think?
It is impossible to ban science. Many would like to ban it. In fact, what is science? Science and scientists, in general, are inconvenient people for society. Don't think that they are liked by everyone. No, scientists are very inconvenient people for society. People would like to live the way they lived before, meaning those in power. The powers that be don't want to change anything. It's good for them as it is. But studying history, one can conclude that science breaks everything anyway. It always broke all barriers, breaks them, and probably will continue to break them. I'm not a prophet. I cannot say what will happen in the future, but it always broke them. Let's talk about the history of science from the perspective of the new chronology and from the traditional one as well. How did science exist in the first place? What did it start with? Let's take ancient Greek science. These are academies: Plato, Aristotle. They walked around in gardens, reasoned, did something. Did someone pay them money for that? No. It was science for its own sake and at its own expense. Then, if you came up with something interesting, you could write a book, present it to some prince, ruler, and possibly get paid for it. But that came later. First, you had to do all this and write. In general, science started as something free and unpaid. Only the well-off could engage in it, or those who hoped that when they did something like that, they would be paid for it later. I won't now delve into the details that follow from the new chronology, but let's move on. When did science begin to be paid for? When did it end up on the state payroll? First, from the perspective of traditional history. Initially, it was free and unpaid. But then, in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages of ignorance, universities suddenly appeared, where people began to discuss all sorts of nonsense on state money. Scholastics started studying things like how many demons or angels could be located on the head of a pin. They engaged in such nonsense, but for money. There were professor positions, and paid science emerged. Where did it come from? Why? For what purpose? Supposedly, it started with the acceptance of Christianity. Look, at first, there was no Christianity. Actually, it existed but was a persecuted faith. Then, when Constantine the Great adopted Christianity, everything kind of went downhill. Initially, this free, unpaid science ended, and instead, this nonsense, scholasticism began, but now it was paid. Universities were founded. Who did all this? Who came up with it? Christians invented all this. They had to develop their theology, and therefore, seizing power, becoming the state religion, they made such a mess. All these universities engaged in all kinds of nonsense for many centuries, and they were paid for it, until the time of the Reformation, when in the 15th, 16th centuries, science suddenly decided to recall ancient achievements. Then science seemed to revive. It still remained paid, but now it stopped dealing with all sorts of nonsense and engaged in real science, the kind that the ancient Greeks were engaged in. That's the picture. If you look at the traditional chronology, this is what we get. And how is it really, from the perspective of the new chronology? I'll briefly repeat it. Science did start as unpaid, that's absolutely correct. It was like that until the adoption of Christianity, that's also absolutely correct. And why did it suddenly become paid after the adoption of Christianity? Not because Christians decided to develop their dogma at the expense of taxpayers' pockets. Not because of that. It happened because apostolic Christianity came to power, and it all happened because gunpowder was invented in Christian monasteries. Science, so to speak, showed its teeth. Gunpowder was invented. The armies of the previous emperors, who were supposed to win 100%, and they didn't doubt that at all, those armies were defeated. Many noble people lost everything or perished. The nobility didn't need it at all. But they understood that this was something that had to be kept under control. And that's when science was put on a payroll. It was in Christian monasteries, and seizing the opportunity, Christians developed scholasticism. However, they were not only engaged in scholasticism. Later, it all somehow developed over time and went through a rather complex path. I won't delve into it now. But since then, the authorities have regarded science as something that needs to be kept under control because otherwise, the fruits of science can benefit someone else. Not because they need it. Not because they want science to come up with something new, to change something. No, they don't want that. They want that if science discovers something, it should first be theirs. So, science exists. It is paid for. But don't think that its fruits are eagerly awaited. No, it's not like that. Maybe someone who is dissatisfied with life is waiting for something, but someone who is content, for whom everything is good, is not waiting for anything. He wishes it to be as it was before. But it was understood that science cannot be driven into a dead end. Even if it's not subsidized, underground, as it was before, it will still someday come up with something groundbreaking, and they will get more than they bargained for. Therefore, nowadays we have this state of affairs.
Last question. Gleb Vladimirovich. Do you need the help of young programmers in your research?
What does it mean, need or not need? We do, but once again, our research is not funded. Anatoly Fomenko and I earn our living through mathematics. I work with neural networks, programming under contracts. We earn through mathematics. As for chronology, it has always been something for our soul. Not even for the soul. No, that's incorrect. For the soul, it goes without saying. As mathematicians, we are accustomed to the idea that if you have a task that has come into your hands, and you took it, then it's yours, you must complete it. It's your responsibility. It came to you, and you, as a mathematician, as a scientist, are obligated to advance it. Whether you are paid for it or not. Obligated. That's our approach. So, we have always been involved in it, even though it mainly brought us setbacks. Although, it's not always the case, but the idea of earning a living through the new chronology is a bad idea. A very bad idea, let's put it that way. Although historians fantasize a lot about us, and think that we are taking the bread out of their mouths, but that's not true. We are not taking away their livelihood. Therefore, we can't offer much to these programmers. After all, programming is hard work. No one coded new chronology programs for us. We wrote all code ourselves. Mainly me, as a programmer. Anatoly Fomenko and I discussed things, but we did everything ourselves. So, from an organizational standpoint, this subject is a bit tricky.
Perhaps some students would like to take on a certain, let's say, coursework topic. Regardless, they still need to do something related to the analysis of big data, training large models. They could train them on kittens and puppies or historical data.
No, we don't do that. Because there would be an outcry, and then it would come at a price. If students come to us, we refuse them. Sometimes such students come, and we refuse them.
All right, let them do it themselves if they want, if they find it interesting.
While they are students. Yevgeny Yeliseyev has been working with us for many years. But he had already graduated from the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics when he started working with us. It wasn't work as part of his education.
I've run out of questions. Thank you very much. I'm sure our readers have learned even more. I would like them to read your books and visit your website. We'll definitely provide a link below.
If they want to, they can take a look. We're not imposing anything on anyone.
Thank you very much, Gleb Vladimirovich. Goodbye.
Goodbye.